So I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Lexie Hain. Lexie is from New York. She's a sheep producer. I think you can see the picture behind her. Those are her sheep. And she's not just talking about solar grazing, she does it. So she's talking from experience. She's also the executive director of the American Solar Grazing Association. And I'm sure she's going to talk just a little bit about, or talk about that a little bit. As I said, solar grazing is an exciting topic. In Maryland, 14% of our energy comes from renewables. In 10 years, 50% of the electricity in Maryland is going to need to come from renewable sources, of which solar is one of them. So we know, I think in each of our states, we know a lot of solar projects are going to go up. And the hopes is that we can put a lot of sheep under those panels, not only as an income source, a way to grow the industry, a way to add an additional revenue stream. So Lexie, I'll go ahead and turn the program over to you.
Thank you so much, Susan. It is a pleasure to be here this evening. It is an honor. I have a lot of respect for the University of Maryland and your programs. So I have a PowerPoint presentation and I have a lot of pictures I've taken over the past few years. So I will be sharing that with you all. I'll just do a tiny bit of background in that we have a farm here in the Finger Lakes of upstate New York. We are about 10 miles from Cornell University. And before I had sheep, I had a commercial plant nursery and switched over to sheep after I sold the plant nursery. I'd also had a little time working on to support a local wind farm with its development. And basically both those projects came to a close and I needed something else to do with my time. This is about 5 years ago. And so I poked around and discovered that solar grazing was something that was a practice that was in Europe. And I discovered that that sheep were being successfully used at solar sites to manage the vegetation and to the benefit of the farmers. So then I found out that in North Carolina, this was also happening. And from there, and the generosity of the extension service there, I took it. And I had my first grazing contract the following year with one of the solar arrays at Cornell University. Here we go. And so the history of both my grazing business as well as our not-for-profit here is that there were a group of farmers, researchers, but by and large, it's really people with an agricultural interest who came together and realized that there was a need out there to get good information to the farmers, but also to the solar industry about best practices and about what we felt was basically an industry with incredible potential at its very beginning. And so we call it ASGA, American Solar Grazing Association, but we were founded about 4 years ago unofficially, and we are a not-for-profit, and we are doing a bunch of work, but one of the things we really enjoy is doing outreach. The pictures you'll see tonight, many of them are either my sheep or another ASGA board member's sheep or founder's sheep. They're mostly at solar arrays in upstate New York. And I will take tonight to show you some of I'm assuming the audience here is largely, sheep producers, farmers, people interested in pastured livestock, and less of solar industry professionals. But I do a lot of talks to the solar industry as well. It's actually pretty fun. So I'm going to break out some mechanics of how I figured out how to do this, how other people in other parts of the country and the world are doing their solar grazing, why they're doing it, and also a little bit about just basics on solar. I'll also assume that some of the audience is from Maryland, so I'll talk about that. So without further ado, let's see. So I define solar grazing as the grazing of livestock to manage vegetation at solar arrays. And you will see that here, this flock is able to walk right underneath the panels. And you will also notice that there is quite a bit of busyness in the way of metal bits to support those modules. As a farmer put it to me the other day, the purpose of solar grazing in the solar industry's eyes is to keep the sunshine on the panels. And so therefore we have a need. And what is really lovely about sheep is they have many of the native characteristics, qualities that just make them really, really the ideal candidate to manage vegetation at solar sites. And there is a tremendous growth in the solar industry in the United States. We are seeing just the beginning of it. So 3 big reasons when you are out there talking, and I'm trying to give you a few talking points if you are a farmer who's potentially thinking about this, or you're a farmer landowner who might think about it, but maybe is in talks with a solar company. You'll want to know that, you know, sheep do fit under the panels. I have not seen any site modifications made in terms of changing the height of the structures that hold up the panels. They also have a big advantage, I think, in terms of the I was going to say the vision, how the solar industry wants to be perceived. They do their job, and they do it in a way that is historical. They do it in a way that is pastoral. They do it in a way that does not involve lots of landscaping equipment and 2-cycle engines. So, and then the other thing I will say is, you know, when you do this right and you manage the grazing right, you work with the seed mixes, you can have incredibly high biodiversity at your solar sites. And this is also increasingly a goal for many solar firms. It's something we've seen, I think, originated in Europe, and it's now coming to have these additional conservation ecosystem benefits because these solar sites are getting bigger. You'll actually love this picture on the right with the noontime, and what you'll notice is it looks like these solar panels are flat, and they may be flat at noontime. I picked that picture to show you tonight because that is a solar site in Virginia, and that's where my sheep are in the middle of the day as well. They're napping. All right, so what are we up against? So if you're a sheep producer, some things to just know are that you may be competing, depending on which state you reside in, you may be competing directly with landscapers for this job opportunity. The things that you may have going for you is that, especially the drier solar sites, and especially solar sites where the panels are closer to the ground, rocks can easily be caught by those mowers and tossed up and shatter those expensive panels. The other thing you might see is with I did poach that picture from the internet. I don't know what it is, but the space in between the lines of panels, I call those alleys. The alleys can be much easier to mow with traditional maintenance equipment, but underneath the panels is our 4-legged friends have the distinct advantage of really just shining. That's where the sheep really kind of outperform. You'll also know, and it depends on which state, I took these photos at the bottom of the erosion and as well of that heavily herbicided fence. You know, sheep don't do that. If you maintain the conventional management at solar sites that you may also be competing with is, I call it the turf grass regime. It's an intensive regime that's sort of equivalent to a golf course. Very thin, this is a winter picture, one with erosion, but you're very, very thin, regularly mown grasses. And then you have a lot of herbicide use sometimes under the panels. So really what we're looking at is a much more, a model that it makes for a much better neighbor. And also what you're doing is you're creating alliances, and you as the, if you're a sheep producer, you might be a landowner, and you might be more welcoming and a better partner, and you prevent more of the they add to your renewables, but you also, you help keep your agricultural industry alive and strengthen it. All right. So the risks of solar grazing, I pulled some of these, and I'm not going to read them all, but I pulled some of these and wrote them to just show you, again, talking points if you are talking to a solar developer. So what you can say, again, is there's lower risk to that solar infrastructure, to those solar modules, with your grazing practices as a good grazing manager than there would be with conventional, therefore, like a landscaper's management. The National Renewable Energy Lab, NREL, and we'll be putting out more information on this shortly. They've just completed a report. It also talks about the cost competitiveness of solar grazing, which is excellent. There is also just a guideline here that, of course, you're going to want to be up to snuff with your, veterinary care and your compliance and all kinds of your compliance in terms of transporting livestock, all kinds of things like that. So you can avoid most pitfalls that you might otherwise encounter. This is a kind of sort of oversight you have when suddenly your flock of sheep is transported to a place that's more publicly visible. I get phone calls when, did I leave a sheep at the solar site? I see a sheep wandering around, no, but people are concerned. So you have to be aware of that, and people will ask quite innocent and out of the best of their hearts, but you will want to be prepared with being completely organized at your end. Okay, we also have site security benefits. This is another thing I've really made the case to a bunch of solar firms that I personally contract with, that I'm out on my solar sites far more often than any of their technicians who might be there once or twice a year. I'm out checking on things. I'm out finding the loose wires. I'm out finding some other little issue, and I call it in, and I'm also there just as a physical presence. I might be working for a company that might be based in Maryland or might be based in Boston. That's pretty common that the firm you're working with might be based, 1,000 miles away, might appreciate that phone call. So the other thing, just to put this all right at the front of the presentation, is there are some management ways you can manage around sheep manure. Obviously, managed intensive rotational grazing is one way, but you'll just want to be aware that there are places in the array where you will want to discourage the sheep from spending a lot of time. There are ways to do that. And then also, yes, sheep are alive and therefore they die. And you will want to have a plan for what to do if you're on a solar site and a sheep dies. Where would you take your sheep? Just a thought you'll want to think about. Aha. And so I know you're thinking there's lots of solar, and of course there's things like rooftop solar. We are not talking about rooftop solar. I have this photo is from a friend of mine in Hawaii who does the solar grazing. So just to break it into kind of types of solar, we're talking about photovoltaics, solar PV, anything mounted to the ground. We are typically talking about it, again, it doesn't need to be raised racking. It doesn't need to be something called pole mounted. It is simply just standard photovoltaics. And that is what we are going to see a lot in the United States in the next 5 to 10 years. So there are two kind of classes of solar, and there is not, to my knowledge, there is not a federal standard here. So you will have something that is called community scale or direct generation. I call it DG. Those are the smaller solar farms, and those might be the ones that are sending you little notes in the mail that say something like, become a subscriber to your local solar array. That is this community scale and DG. That tends to be, say 50 acres to 5 acres in size. And then we have utility scale or grid scale solar. I consider that to be something, again, larger than 50 acres, maybe larger than 70 acres. And as large as, I believe there's a new array now permitted for something like 18,000 acres. Okay. So then we have something called CSP. Occasionally you will run into this. It is concentrated solar power. It involves mirrors. There are just a couple CSP plants in the United States. Please just sort of generally know that if you run into this CSP and are there mirrors, this is not solar grazing, and you just move right along. Okay, so we're talking about direct generation or utility scale solar from this point forward. So we want to talk about then, solar, and generally, we're talking about the energy industry has its own vocabulary. So I'm not going to do too much of this, but it is going to be helpful for you to know that, and here I define it differently in terms of size. Oh, well, is that, maybe it's not even on the next slide. Okay, no, it's what is, how many acres to a megawatt? This is important because when you are working with developers, and you will find often that there is press, but typically a county or a state or a town may be the one who is reviewing the permits for your solar project. And so you will want to say, this project is, say, 10 megawatts. That project is probably, if it's 10 megawatts, it is probably between, so it's 5 to 10 acres per megawatt. So you can just multiply by 5 to 10. I'd say on average, we are now looking at, if you wanted to pick a number, I would actually pick something like 7 or 8. So just to be clear, if I'm grazing, I don't want to get too bogged down in this, but if I'm grazing a solar site, I price my contracts based on how many acres. So it is worth my time to then calculate how many acres I'm grazing, because that, as the sheep producer and the grazer, is the term I'm used to working on. Just so you know, for scale, this is a solar array that I believe is 70 megawatts, and it is in Pennsylvania. It is part of the new Pennsylvania State University arrays, the Penn State arrays. Okay, we're going to do a couple components of the solar array. This is something I just wrote for this presentation, so to give you all a sense of what you'll be looking at. I've discovered over the years that it is amazing how few people have actually been inside solar sites. So I have some close-ups for you, and just generally you get a sense of what you're working with here. So I think the key thing here is that you are producing electricity on these solar sites, comes from the sun, and it will all end up through, well, it starts with the panels, and then there will be some solar infrastructure, and then everything will end up out on the grid, and depending, basically it'll end up on the grid. We'll just leave it simple. So I have a few photos here to show you some different components. So one thing you'll note, this is a solar site that I took a picture of. I have to remember, I think this was in North Carolina. And what is interesting here is that you'll notice it looks like an I-beam pounded into the ground. That's basically what it is. These solar sites are usually leased for 20 to 25 years on average, and they often have lease extensions. But these sites are sort of designed in a way and permitted in a way that they will actually be fully removable at the end of the project at the 25 or 30 or 35 year time frame. That's how they're designed to be built. And the majority of them, if the soils allow, are just like this, where if there's a firm soil, they'll be pounded into the ground, or there are a series of screws. They're actually just giant screws that are screwed into the ground and can be unscrewed and pulled right back out. There's not typically any buried concrete. That's actually pretty rare. The other thing to note is for this style of solar, you can see that there's actually, this is a fixed, the posts are fixed. This racking does not move. And also the solar panel is only on one side. Another innovation we're seeing is that in fact, there are solar panels where there are the solar cells and the modules are on both sides. And that happens on this fixed, and it also happens on what we'll see are the movable solar sites. So these are called bifacial panels. Okay, so we have the posts, we have the solar panels, we have the racking, which is the shiny bit in the picture, which is what I wanted to show you. And then we'll want to just also note that there are wires. Every single one of these panels has to be connected by wires. Sometimes these wires are dangling and sometimes they're tidally sleeved. We also have perimeter fences. Perimeter fences are a requirement of the National Energy Code. And so you will see perimeter fences around all of these solar sites. That is a good thing if you're a sheep producer. We can get into that. Then we have some other things that are the electrical equipment, where we're talking about converting the electricity from DC to AC. So these are transformers and inverters. And then we also have something called aux power boxes and substations. You will not run into substations unless you are dealing with a utility scale solar site, by and large. Okay, so here's a second picture. This is a different kind of racking. This is a solar site in New York. And what you'll notice here, and you notice in a lot of coastal solar sites, is that because of the soils, you end up needing a lot. You don't have those thick posts. You end up with these thin posts, and you end up with 4 posts and lots of cross beams. Now, as a sheep producer, you know that your sheep will just walk around. But if you were to manage this solar site using, you know, weed whackers or trying to use mowers, you will fail. And so you end up having to use weed whackers and herbicides. All right. So you can also see the perimeter fence on the one side here. Now here we have a solar site in Pennsylvania where you'll see that these are the trackers, single axis tracker. And you think of it this way because it is simply like a sunflower, and they literally follow the sun. They also, they move very slowly. They are quite quiet. They can move a couple different ways. I don't have to get into all of this right now, but there are things like hydraulic rams that use, but there's different mechanics and machinery that actually power those or engage the mechanics because they actually move in groups all together. Quietly and slowly, I wouldn't say it's ever a health risk. The other thing they do is they can dump the snow. They have a cute little dump feature. And you can see the engineer's drawing rendition here in this particular case. The yellow box here is one of these sort of converters. And here we have, these are the inverters. The yellow box is a single inverter. The other photo where you have the sheep peeking out behind, those are called string inverters. And string inverters are fairly common now, where they actually group all the inverters together. Again, as a sheep producer, if you end up as a solar grazer, you probably don't need to know too much about this, but every once in a while, I'll be asked to sort of peek at an error message on an inverter. And that is something that the company I'm working for finds helpful. Here are our transformers. Again, it's a little bit of a bigger solar site, and this is back to this place in Pennsylvania. They actually built them up on the gravel bed, which is not something that I've actually seen before. But generally, this is the only concrete you will see on your solar sites. There's concrete surrounding these transformers, and you know your sheep, they will find the most comfortable place to sit. And I find that the only trouble I have, and this goes back to sheep poop, is that sometimes we need to exclude our friends from the transformer pad area. Okay, and I'll have a picture of that in a minute. Now, what is neat is that a few of these firms are really committing to solar grazing. And this is these are a few sites in New York State where, as you can see, they are designing the solar sites that you see that, in fact, that the solar hasn't changed at all, but the actual layout has changed in terms of their interior paddock fences, their gates. You know, we can have working dogs, but more importantly, this water. They are putting in wells at these solar sites, and that is just phenomenal. And then the other thing they do, this goes back to our aux boxes, is that at the transformer pads, they are putting in 220 and or 110, but that can drive the well pump. Anyway, just something I'm very excited about. I get excited about these aux boxes and I ask if they're going to have them, because the other thing I do is I plug in my Energizer. Maybe you can plug in a heated water bowl, but it's handy. So this is sort of your ideal situation. And here we have something where I think I'm going to review some other things that you will want to do at your solar site. So setting up for the good grazing here. So I'm saying good signs. Your signs should be on every single perimeter gate, and it should include your phone number. I also often offer to host a training if I'm working at a new solar array. It's really for the electrical workers who also will be coming on site. Again, maybe just twice a year, but I offer to say, you know, come meet those sheep. I'll introduce you and we'll come up with a system of protocol so that if you ever have to work and you want me to move them, you know, we have a plan. Anyway, phone number is essential. The next thing in terms of planning your solar array is if you can work with a developer, and some of them are definitely doing this now, is working with them on picking seed mixes. The sort of industry default standard we talked about was just sort of maybe letting the landscaper choose. And also they have a lot of concerns and permitting hurdles, compliance around, you know, erosion. So just something, a fast growing fescue mix is what they're going to put in, unless someone like someone with some sheep industry experience helps you out or helps them out. I will note that ASGA has worked with the team at the Cornell Sheep Program, as well as the Ernst Seed House, to develop this fuzz and buzz seed mix. And what we've done there, there's two fuzz and buzzes, and what we tried to do is offer something that is affordable to the solar industry, that is scalable for them, but that also offers flowers that are grazing tolerant. There's some legumes in there, but also that can offer some, you know, native pollinator flowers. They are basically templates. We did that this year. It did very well. And we're going to expand it for next year. I think we sold almost 12,000 pounds of seed, which we were really excited since it's our first year. But we're hoping to expand on that philosophy of basically being these sites that offer grazing compatibility with these other, you know, biodiversity, insect hosts, so on and so forth. Okay, so not all perimeter fences are the same, and I think I have a picture coming up, but I do actually. It's the next slide. But this is sort of your ideal fence situation. The sliding gate fence is a solar site in Ontario, where the farmer actually, you know, I think the farmer has 2,000 or 3,000 acres of land and leased just a couple hundred to this solar firm and did a bunch of research on it. But he already produced sheep at a commercial scale and also did some pasturing. And he said, and he knew about the coyote pressure in his area, and he thought it was really high. So he worked with the solar firm to get sort of this, you know, really bulletproof, predator-proof fencing put in, including this amazing gate. The other pictures are photos in Florida, where solar grazing is taken off at a massive scale, and you will see they do herbicide that fence line on the outside, but there are a lot of predator species that would otherwise dig underneath, and you see that the chain link. It also has that rigid chain link with a tension along the bottom, which I really like to see. So if you're, you know, what do you do if you have something else to work with? We see this new, one of the trends is sort of wildlife friendly fences, which can be a raised set of fences. So it's like, oh my gosh, there's a beautiful fence. Wait, no, you've raised it 6 inches off the ground. That's a pretty unfortunate situation. So try and, with the solar grazers, we try and encourage the wildlife fences to have other ways to account for wildlife. I have plenty of wildlife in my solar sites. I do routine inspections, as well as when I get a new contract, I definitely walk the perimeters, and then I patch any little gaps in the bottom of the fence. I do know people who keep guardian dogs in the solar sites, as well as other types of guardian animals. That's certainly another option. And then of course, my little handy dandy shot here of the gate with my patch, that is simply a solar site where the gate fence, the gap with the fence was too great. And I felt that lambs could escape or dogs could get in. So I just sort of crafted that. All right, here we have an expensive solution, but one that in this case, the solar company paid for, to excluding these transformer pads, you know, from any sheep. Again, I don't think there's any danger. The sheep will not hurt this electrical equipment. But what I find is that you're just trying to keep the electrical maintenance workers happy. So in an ideal world, and I have a few, several photos here, you know, the solar firms would actually put in interior paddock fencing for you, like the first photo. But if you're not, since most of the time we're not in the ideal world, you know, here I am on a weekend putting up my fence. And you can actually see that I mowed in front of the fence here. You will want to do that for proper management. And, you know, I've gotten, I do think there's enough evidence, and I've talked to electrical engineers and have some documentation, but there's just no danger to the electrical infrastructure of the solar that you would cause with your little tiny, you know, portable charger. We have other styles of interior fencing. I'll note that, of course, if you start putting up more fencing, you will need to check on it and check on the health of your animals with frequency. These are sites in New York and Pennsylvania, but for I focus here on the fact that you are still managing your sheep, definitely, for this to work well. Of course, you're going to need water. This year I hauled more water than I've ever hauled. I've often been able to collect the water off the solar sites, and this was not the year for that. I bought a lot more water tubs, and I hauled water in tanks, and so did everyone else. So other years on the sites, you know, I can just let the water drip off and the rain replenishes all my barrels, but this was not the year. So I want a well. Okay, some tools of the trade. You will, there's a lot more to this, but basically you will, you know, you'll want to be able to have a truck and trailer or have a trucking contract, bring your sheep to the solar site. And the safest way to do that, and is because you are, of course, you know, bringing your sheep to a new location, is simply to drive the truck and trailer right into the site. There are spaces inside these sites because of how the electrical engineering works, are just blocks of like open pasture, and you can just drive in usually. Sometimes there's turnaround areas. So that's my recommendation for the safest way to keep your animals safe. The other thing is, you know, you're going to want to collect your animals, and you're also going to want to potentially handle them. So at the solar site, that I have a 40-acre site I manage, you spend the longest on every summer, and I've now put a handling system up that I leave there. So just knowing that, you know, you're going to need to sometimes catch them, sort them, manage them, health checks, you name it. So that is something that, you know, I let my solar company know. I send them a picture. I'm going to bring this over, and, you know, fine. And then, of course, you're going to need to collect your sheep again. So our joke in our family is that this is all, you know, the idea of the dogs. Our dogs are controlling all this, because all I do is spend more money on more fancy herding dogs, but they're awesome. You do need to be able to get them. And of course, it is challenging because you can see your line of sight here can be difficult. So you need to have a plan to get the sheep off the site. and a way to collect them, portable fencing, so on. Next, this is just a little bit about industry standards. The solar industry is developing industry standards for maintenance. They often have perimeter plantings. They call them screenings. You can see these little cedars. These pictures were taken, I stole them out of one of these new sets of standards for a solar firm, guilty as charged. So you'll potentially want in your vegetation maintenance contract to offer perimeter mowing. I do not recommend you use your sheep for that. You will be outside and you will be in a strange neighborhood potentially. And there also might be trees to maintain. So I would just suggest that perimeter mowing, and probably in Maryland twice a season, you can work it out with them. The other thing I know is I have a farmer I'm working with in upstate New York. He actually got the contract to put in all the perimeter plantings as part of his solar grazing work. Fantastic, more work for him. Okay, I have a little here on Maryland. Just to give you a sense, Maryland's actually a little bit tricky. I'm not going to dwell on it, but there's been some constrictions in development queue for Maryland. So but I brought this up just to show you also the graph, which is how to read this. So this is a chart I got from this, you can see SEIA, SEIA, there's the Solar Energy Industry Association. And the point of these graphs is you'll just want to look at the light blue in terms of the potential for grazable solar. The light blue is the utility scale as well as the DG or community scale solar. Ignore the other colors. And in this case, that was only the first half of 2020. The other thing I wanted to show you is I have national rankings of how much solar is being installed. And I think I just brought this up to show you that, Texas is #1 and New York, where I live, is #5. And then I did find Maryland, here we are, we're at 19. So, respectable, and you're definitely going to get some more solar. The other thing to just note, and I have this here at the end in red, IEER is an institute in Maryland. It has a Renewable Maryland initiative, and it also has a report forthcoming on solar and farmland, and also solar dual use and farm viability. So worth talking to them. To give you a sense of the appetite for solar and what's likely to come in the United States, here we have this pale blue again, the utility scale solar, and on the left we have megawatts, and we have 2020 expectations. You see not a big drop even with COVID. We can do the math, but it looks like 15,000 megawatts. It's a lot of acres. I spoke to a developer this afternoon who in New York alone is developing what will be 10,000 acres of ground mounted solar that will all be built in the next 5 to 7 years. One developer. This is a photo of, again, from SEIA. This is the orange here is under development. The yellow is our operating photovoltaic. And so we're going to really look at the red, orange, and yellow. And the red, of course, is under construction. So you can see where the construction is very active. Looks like Georgia, Florida. And it looks like where a lot of, I call it the project queue, but where there's a lot coming, which is orange. And you can see, look at the coast. Look at where we are. Okay. And I can get into why this is, but I only have 45 minutes, and I think I'm pushing it as this. So I think there's a few slides here on thinking about if you are going to engage in solar grazing, what is the process? How do I kind of start working with the developer? Well, the reality is you're going to want to start working with them as soon as you're in that orange planning phase. As soon as a project looks like it is probably likely to be built, not just maybe, but it's looking solid on their end, that's when it's really good to start talking to them and spending a little time on this. You'll just want to sort of break it into these things of, one, what are the land use goals? Yes, there's the one, they want to produce electricity, but what are their other goals and objectives? Many of these companies are now developing objectives for, for biodiversity or for producing agricultural goods. And in some cases, there are state and local mandates around this and requirements around this. So it's worth asking. So you can define, what space am I working in? Next is, I'm not going to go through all of this, but the general idea is you will want to spend some time with the side of the firm that actually does the operations if possible. Some of these firms, if you can get through to the right people, they will be willing to do that. You can invite them to your farm. You can show them how it works on your farm and how you'd like to do it there. Show them examples of your work. You will want to make a grazing plan with someone who does that. You will want to help with those seed mixes. You will want to think through your watering, your trailering, your transport. And then something I'm suggesting to people, and we do have example solar grazing contracts on the solargrazing.org website, on the ASGA website. For some people, a pilot project might be the right way to start, especially now as we're talking about projects that are quite large. It might be best to start with a 40-acre solar site, and you can always make a big project small. So just a suggestion for you on a strategy there. And then thinking about your budget, which I think we can talk about more, but we are hoping to offer some support in that area in the upcoming year. We talked about how big the sites are, megawatts. Remember, like 1 megawatt, probably about 7 acres plus or minus. You'll want to think about what's planted there now. We see solar going in on wooded hillsides. We will see a whole solar being planted right into cornfields. So thinking about, if there's already a hayfield there and they're just planting into the hayfield, that might be the best case scenario for an easier transition. Or if they're planting right into like a muddy old cornfield, it might be a couple of years before you can bring that stocking rate up. Again, water. How are you going to water your animals, and how are you going to move water to them within the sites? And then I just think about flow. I look at the project maps. I look at the CAD drawings. I look at often the Google Earth, and I'll look at a planned project, and I will think about how I want to move animals around it, and I will want to think about fencing. There's one study that I participated in here that will give you a sense of what people are charging to do the solar, what some of the rates are in solar grazing. There's another one that should be out very shortly with the National Renewable Energy Lab. When that is out, we will put that on our website. This study is now almost 3 years old, and I will explain it a little bit just to say that what we did is I worked with the team at Cornell. We called people who were doing the solar grazing in a number of states, and we asked them to participate in a survey. Our sample size was good, and we only chose certain eastern states because we wanted to make sure they were states where there's rainfall. And so there was vegetation maintenance. We excluded areas, Utah and Southern California. We just wanted it to be all from the upper Midwest and Northeast and Mid-Atlantic. So when I say, if you look at income, expenses, and net, if you go to directly contracted, this is you, the farmer, or the farmer grazer operation, and what your directly contracted rate is. If you're a subcontractor, it's again, you, the farmer, but you are underneath then another entity. That tends to be someone with maybe more comprehensive insurance, or maybe a landscaper who already has the contract. I will note that New York State looks like it's a much more lucrative place to work. Part of why New York State is higher is that New York State only had community scale solar at the time of the study. So we only had project sites that were sort of 50 acres and smaller. And when you start having the smaller sites, the rates tend to go up, because I have found, and potentially you will find, there are some efficiencies to be gained when you get to these bigger sites. And the expenses are things, and there is a whole report, you can find it on our website under our research tab. Okay, I'm going to talk about some people who do this and like how it works for their farm. Some people are lucky enough to have it right next to their farm, and these people actually do have to trailer their sheep, but they work with a local university in Pennsylvania who has a solar array, and they are able to work with a vet student who checks on their sheep every day. So they have I think this year this will be their 4th or 5th year doing it, and they have a dedicated flock now of dry ewes they just use for the solar grazing, and then it works into the rest of their farm operation, which you can kind of see some of here. And it's a small family farm, and even then, though, it has enough insurance. One thing to note is if you own your own farm, you tend to have generally the right insurance, or you might just need to buy a little bit more, $1,000 to $2,000 worth, I find. But you can usually get pretty close to the requirements of what the solar farm needs. This is another kind of neat example. The solar sheep in New Jersey has taken off from being another hobby flock with a dog, a herding dog, to a pretty big operation. And here she is, Julie Bishop, next to her Farm Credit East guy, because she'd just gotten the money. She's got a new barn up. I think she's at 750 ewes now, and she's at something like year 7 of this. She grazes almost entirely these single axis tracker sites. And you can see the picture up top with a little, they have especially these earlier single axis tracker sites have these very complicated sets of rails and cords and wires. And the reason she was so successful is because the mowers just couldn't do it. Oh, this is my grazing business, Agrivoltaic Solutions. Just there I am. That's me all summer. But what it's showing you a little bit is, here I have the portable handling system. Here you have to be able to move your sheep from place to place. You have to have a plan for that, grain, dogs, chutes, all of it. And then the other thing is there's a thing in the center. You see this sort of almost like Christmas wires. That is a cab cable system. You do now see more of this cab cabling, which is collection lines. And I ended up even taking wildlife cams there to show the solar farm that the sheep were not going to interfere, and they were going to duck right under, and they were not going to chew. So that's sort of a wildlife cam shot. There are a number of other business models emerging in the United States. And if you had to ask me, I would say we're above 10,000 acres of grazed solar sites right now. Carolina Solar Services largely grazes community scale solar. They are, anyway, family-owned business, but they they do use the Guardian donkeys. And a neat thing about their firm is that they are complete operations and maintenance service firm. So they offer all the electrical service work and the vegetation maintenance. And so they have this complementary suite of services, which I think is very smart. And those numbers are actually probably wrong on how many sheep. It's more every time I talk to them. Then I don't spend a lot of time on utility scale solar on this talk, but here are a couple photos to just show you. This is about a 400-acre solar site. This one's in South America, just to show you kind of the breadth of this industry. It's in Uruguay, and it's managed by a Spanish firm, and I think it had something like 2 agronomists on site, and they'd figured out all the wool markets. I mean, just kind of really inspiring, awesome. But part of what was interesting about it is that the firm has a 20+ year contract for the grazing, which I always say in my talks. I'm typically working on a 1 to 5 year contract. A 20-year contract, then it's worth, investing in some infrastructure, some fences, some really good watering. The other picture in here is to just show you the sun-raised farms, which really are some of the people responsible for bringing solar grazing to this country and popularizing it in North Carolina. And I just love how many animals are going to be inside this solar site. Okay, so what doesn't work with solar grazing? Here's the picture of the wildlife fence. Just a perfect fence. and then they went and raised it 6 inches. Well, that's not going to work. So in terms of wildlife friendly, I have seen another model of fence that has a little box around it, but just sort of discouraging this enthusiasm for wildlife friendly fences if you have the opportunity, and encouraging them to fences that are predator proof. Just note that, you know, highly contaminated soils probably won't work for solar grazing, mostly because it depends on what you're doing with your sheep. And I do know some people who do graze landfills and also solar on landfills. There's also sometimes subsidized, incentivized solar on brownfield sites. So I'm mentioning it, just be aware of that. And then we have these loose and dangling wires. Not all solar sites have loose dangling wires, but again, here's a picture of a brand new solar site that does in fact have dangling wires. So, you know, if it doesn't actually matter if it's a sheep or if it's a mower, wires like those black loops are a problem. So we'll want to make sure that those are sleeved. Generally, I try and encourage the solar firm to do that, but just sort of a word to the wise there. And then we talked about it already, the CSP. Okay, so I have a few other things on, like, what other agriculture are we seeing at solar sites and what else is compatible with solar grazing. The most popular is, here's the buzz and the fuzz and buzz, is solar beekeeping. You absolutely can find now bee yards at solar sites. You see people selling solar honey. You see people solar honey beer and other value-added products. What I like to emphasize is that this is potentially another sign of good management of the land and good management of your solar array. And if you're doing the proper grazing, you will also have enough food and for your bees. You will have enough nectar available to them. So I like to talk about the inherent compatibility there, because I really do want to, you know, say this is going to be our big shot in the sheep industry of doing the right thing. So quickly, a few other shots here. The other thing about the beekeeping, and I'm going to get to it, is that it may also solve some other permitting hurdles for your solar firm. So kind of a lot of words on here, but I figure you can look later. What we can talk about is that, again, the solar site seed mix, yes, it should include flowering plants. Ideally, a mix of legumes as well as native plants, and native plants that are sun and shade tolerant and on the spectrum. Again, some kind of grazing plan should be made. You will be happier that way. I also make my own every year. Strategy, think through how I'm going to do it this season, especially as every year the portfolio expands. Okay, so there are these scorecards called the pollinator. They're called the pollinator scorecards. The Center for Pollinators in Energy, or Fresh Energy, do have a series of these scorecards. Maryland does have one, and it also has solar beekeeping guidelines. So it's just so if you end up becoming a solar beekeeper, you can go there. And I do know people who are successfully doing it, but there are things about how to site your bee yard with consideration for bears and with consideration for the electrical service workers and other factors. Our organization, American Solar Grazing Association, did work with a number of solar beekeepers, as well as with our supporting law clinic this year, to create a solar beekeeping contract. We just thought it would be an interesting project, in part because it was not clear how the money should flow and what the expectations were for this very small industry. So right now, we would have that publicly available free on our website. I expect it after the new year. But you can see that there are a few different producers who specialize in this, and you, in some cases, can hire them to come and help you set up your beekeeping operation. Pretty neat specialty business. I just want to note that. And of course, something where you can earn real income. It can also solve a problem for the beekeepers, as I've discovered, because beekeepers, like a lot of other farmers, are losing land. And so for them to suddenly have a space where there's not going to be maybe any or much in the way of herbicide use, and where they have, they can get a truck in and access, and then maybe they can bring the bees to an area at the solar site or right outside, which is what I prefer, in between pollination contracts. Anyway, I do think it provides potentially a really useful resource for especially commercial beekeepers. So here we have these pollinator scorecards. I know this is a lot of material, but pollinator scorecards, which are something that you don't really have to worry about. You just know that if you're in a state with a pollinator scorecard, look it up and see what those requirements are. Because if you end up managing sheep on your solar site, you should pull that up and say, oh, look at this. Here are these requirements around herbicide use, for example. So you'll want to know that. And it will also impact, sometimes they'll ask you to manage your sheep in a certain way. And you'll think, why? And you think, these are pollinator scorecards. Okay, so what other agricultural is compatible with solar grazing? This is the other biggie, which is, and I would love to see more solar sites designed to accommodate at least some haymaking. So this is a flat, pretty much dead flat solar site, 200 acres in Ontario. And it is in fact designed in a way so that there are not that many, like the wires are all buried. So you can actually drive a narrow tractor, but a tractor in those alleys. And one thing as as your sheep producer, you'll suddenly realize when you start thinking, oh gosh, I've got to manage 200 acres of solar. I only have 100 sheep to start. If you can make hay, it does help you as you're building your flock, right? And it also helps you, just another tool in your belt. You think, okay, well, at least I'll make hay over there, and it helps you with those winter feed bills. Okay, and then I have my picture of my monarch here, caterpillar, because as a reminder that there's a good Yale study out and there's also a national lab study out, I think it's coming up, that documents the value of healthy pollinator crops, healthy pollinator gardens and insects, and when at solar sites and when they are adjacent to pollinator dependent crops. So they've actually worked out the economics of that, which is fascinating. Okay, I'm almost done. I think I'm way over time. Okay, what other agriculture is compatible with solar? Okay, so I think the other thing is that here's some data from this national labs, highly dependent, pollinator dependent agriculture, and where the pollinator dependent agriculture is. And then and then what they did is the studies, they figured out how far it was from a solar site. So basically, could agriculture benefit if we had these pollinator friendly kind of initiatives right next to the solar sites? I think the short answer was yes. And then of course we've got to work in, and we have to then manage the vegetation or we get trees. So let's bring in our sheep. Okay. I put in some URLs here. You can all kind of look later. The one at the very bottom is from our National Renewable Energy Lab, and this is going to be the portal for information in the United States on solar and land use. Okay, then sort of in closing, we're really at the beginning of this, and there's a lot of really neat agrivoltaics, dual use, multi-use, and here, here's a couple pictures with it's one of my daughters, and we're at a solar array that's like 4 acres, and it was built in this sort of industrial brownfield. And this lovely family who actually built this array decided to open it up to the public, and they have an egg layer cooperative. They have 40 families that sign up every year, and they all come and they tend the chickens on a schedule. And they collect the rainwater in the little the little gutter troughs. And you know, the whole thing was really charming. And then they've got goldfish in the cisterns to keep the algae down. It was awesome. But you know, I think we're at the beginning of a lot of how this, you know, land can be used in such a smart way. Here it is right in this neighborhood, for the benefit of all of us. I also have here just a guidebook. The British do have some really nice manuals. One is Agricultural Good Practice, but at solar farms. But what I liked about these are, one, it talks about things that you can get into the technical installation details of how not to disturb the soil so much when you're putting in the solar. But more importantly, you actually get to some of the like family stories of how, you know, people are grazing the solar sites, or bringing poultry or bringing geese on the solar site, and how it integrated with that small and mid-sized family farm. And of course, what they didn't get into, but what is very important, is what it meant for their economics and how it stabilized their farming operation. Okay, which leads me into, there's a whole lot coming here on farm viability and solar. You're at the top, there's 2 reports coming out. And again, we will host all of this information on our website under the research tab as these studies come out. Solargrazing.org. Solar leasing guides, especially if you will find that if you will have land that's in a certain area, perhaps next to a substation or a transmission line, you will probably get a lot of phone calls. So the Farm Bureau, your extension service here in Maryland, American Farmland Trust, SEIA is the industry association, all have solar leasing guides. I think New York actually has some really excellent guides on solar leasing in our New York Farm Bureau. So just saying, that's all options. Those are all available. I also am finding that, for example, the like Penn State Extension and Penn State Law School, and in our case, our Pace University Law School, is offering free or very low charge legal help to farmers in this case. Okay, then we have solar land requirements. I'm way over time, but I'll just sort of mention that how much land is going to be used for solar. There's some thoughtful documents there, but it might be about 1% of the United States. I don't know. I'm leaving that to the engineers. And then there's some tools now being developed about solar siting and being more thoughtful about it. Actually, was just on a call this morning with folks from Virginia Tech about it. So perhaps right in Virginia, they'll figure it out. But the idea is that there are now some tools and guidelines that, you know, developers are not required to use, but that are increasing going to help kind of steer the development process. And oh yes, these are my, I guess, more children. I've got to do it. I threw them in to say what other agriculture is compatible with solar. Sorry. Advantages of using sheep. It works. It's compatible with these other requirements, such as the pollinator-friendly projects. It does keep the land in agricultural use. And in many cases, you know, like for me, it's expanded the amount of land my farm has access to. And it does provide opportunities for people that don't have land at all. There are some programs for that. And there's all these other pasture benefits you probably know more about than I do. But the general idea is that it works. And if you do it right, usually, you know, the way I try to embed it, and many other people do, we try and come in under what the landscapers might charge. So lastly, I'll just say a little about what ASGA is doing. One thing we have, and I do encourage you to use it if you join ASGA, we do have this solar grazing map, which you can then list your farm business on, and you can say, I'm a sheep producer and I want to be part of this. So that is really important because I have been reasonably successful at getting this message out to the solar industry. And for example, just that one developer tonight who said, oh, I think I probably have, you know, 8,000 acres going into production in New York State. Well, we're going to need a lot more sheep and a lot more people who know how to properly manage sheep and also the related supply chains. So please consider participating. We're going to need you all. And there's all kinds of things on our website. We also offer free monthly webinars. It's not just me talking the whole time. We have guests from all over the country, all over the world, talking about solar grazing and all kinds of issues related to it. And then we do have like an app and a member forum that's reasonably well populated now and active, and people are chattering all about what they're doing in the industry.